And on top of that, it's essentially kind of Yoshi's Island because you're throwing balls and they bounce on walls. It's exactly like DX have been in Yoshi's Island, if you remember that. So that's kind of like a pitch I often use.
Yeah, like for me personally, when I think about the way the game plays, I keep thinking like, what if it was a case of think Dragon Ball Z, where rapid fire is actually useful for once. So to follow up on that, the next question is, and we'll start with the team itself first, about how you guys kind of came together and formed Radical Fish Games. Tell me about how that happened.
So most of us started with RPG Maker, essentially, if you know that one. It's not, it doesn't have maybe the best reputation with everybody, but that's how we started. I mean, there was a fairly big RPG Maker community here in Germany. Most of us are from Germany. There's one guy from Austria, and some people moved, but it's mostly German developers. So we had this kind of RPG Maker community. That's how we got to know each other. And then kind of like I started getting into this HTML5 development, and that's something else. I mean, CrossCode also developed in HTML5, and that's how we started developing an HTML5 game. And then I just got together with all the people I've known from this community, and that's how we created Radical Fish Games, essentially.
Gotcha.
That's the idea.
So real quick, why HTML5? No, I'm kidding. Next question. Like I know you get asked that question a lot during the dev streams, and at this point, we kind of get the reason why you chose to go HTML5.
I like to answer this, so it's no problem.
Yeah, so. I mean, hey, if you still want to, by all means, go right ahead.
No, we don't have to talk about this now, but if people want to know, I can talk about HTML5 a long time. But mostly we do it because we just have fun to work with that language. It's and now a lot of people don't like JavaScript, but we actually do, and that's mostly the reason why we are doing it. Not because of cross-platform compatibility or things like that. It's just that I'm very familiar with the technology, and that's why we did it with HTML5. That's a short story.
Yeah, because when I first loaded up the game for the first time and I saw that splash screen there, I'm like, wait a minute, HTML5? You can make games in that? I had no idea, because I have a little bit of programming background with certain languages, but not to an extensive point where I could make video games out of, obviously. But I had no idea that you can go and use HTML5 and JavaScript for something like a game as ambitious as CrossCode.
It's pretty recent. The thing is that I mean, this kind of technology developed. I think the first time I actually did this was in 2011. There was some kind of internship where we had the task to develop an HTML5 game, really, and I actually noticed how the performance got a lot better in this year. Like when I started the internship, it was worse than when I ended the internship, because I noticed there was some browser update and suddenly things were running better. So it's a very recent development that you can actually do this. So they just developed some API that you actually use the proper hardware to accelerate things faster, and that's how it's even possible in the first place. And I think now I actually lost trail, but yeah.
No worries.
What was the question again?
just basically why you chose HTML5 and JavaScript over more conventional engines out there that people use for
right. It's a fairly recent technology, and it's I know I kind of forgot what I wanted to say. That's really strange.
It happens to be.
Anyway, let's just go on.
Yeah, we'll move on. No problem.
Yeah.
But so for Radical Fish Games, like how much of the team would you say is composed of video game veteran developers, and how many of them are actually doing this for the first time, basically?
It's a bit difficult to say. Nobody of us is really professional in the sense that we worked on commercial projects before. I mean, some team members actually are also now working on professional projects in parallel. But when we started the whole thing, I don't think we didn't have any professional people in that sense that we actually worked on commercial projects, something like this. But we did work on games. I mean, we have been around in this RPG Maker community, and in this community you create games, and that is actually a very variable experience that you get there. I mean, even if you're using a simple engine like RPG Maker, there's a lot of concepts that you learn by creating simple RPG Maker games. Stuff like how do you balance the game in a proper way? How do you keep the plot interesting? How how do you grab the player's attention, how do you design the levels interesting. It doesn't matter what engine you are using. This kind of lessons you learn with any engine, and that's what we did essentially. And I personally, I had 2 larger projects before CrossCode. Both of them I didn't finish, but I spent like 4 or 5 years working on those games. And that itself was a very important lesson for me, because I learned a lot of things a lot of mistakes I made back then I didn't repeat for CrossCode. So, and that's true for a lot of members in our team, I think.
That's awesome, because this actually leads into my following question about an RPG game that you made in RPG Maker a while ago that you called Terra's Adventure.
Oh boy, yes. Did you see that stream?
I missed it, but I did catch the a little bit of the archive of it when it was already said and done, and I saw it in the Discord post from a while back, and I'm like, let me check this out really quick and see what this is all about. So yeah, it was actually pretty interesting to see that.
That is a good example, because this was essentially my first game that I released. At least the first game that I actually published on the internet so people could play it. And that was already, I think, the 4th or 5th version of that game. So I actually iterated over things. I created the first game, which was very basic, and then I enhanced it again. And I think there was in the 3rd version I actually changed the battle system. So I just replaced the battle system. Right. So just iterate over things over and over again. But still, I think that version that you saw was maybe 1 or 2 years of work. Back when I was still going to school. And you can actually see that back then there were a lot of strange decisions I made, like this tutorial. I remember that this tutorial was long, but we actually spent half an hour on this tutorial, which was just about the combat system. And the funny thing, once we were out of the tutorial and we were left for the world map, there was suddenly another tutorial. And it just didn't stop. There were like one tutorial after another tutorial. It was like, oh boy. And we have some people complaining that the tutorials in CrossCode are rather long. And I understand this. It's not perfect either, but it's still much, much better compared to what I did back then. So that's one of the lessons I learned, that keep tutorials short if possible.
Plus the game is still on early access on top of that, so you have time to, or at least the ability to change those things before the game.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Of course, it's just that when it comes to tutorials, it's rather difficult to actually adapt this. The thing is, if you played the demo, or actually you have to play a little bit beyond the demo to understand this. But you go through these rooms, and then you have this escape route back through the rooms. And if you now change the structure of these rooms, the pacing of the escape sequence needs to be adapted as well. So that's why it's difficult to adapt the tutorial at this point, just because it's very much integrated into the plot of the game. It's not just inserted; it's actually integrated. It makes it rather difficult to change that, unfortunately. There might be some few details that we fix, but other than that, we are currently more focusing on just finishing the game. We are not trying to make the perfect game, which is first impossible, and second, it's just something that consumes a lot of time. So we of course consider feedback, but we always have to consider if this is actually something that's doable in a certain amount of time.
Right. So it's a case of managing priorities, at least at this point in development. And I guess at this point, you want to just finish the game and get that out the door before you do anything else. So that's totally understandable. Yeah. But so we were talking about your first game. Essentially, you talked about how you learned a bit from the tutorials about what not to do in the case of CrossCode. Were there any other lessons you learned from that game that you translated over into CrossCode as well?
There's generally this whole thing of having a big picture of the game, which is something I didn't have for Taras Adventure, because essentially that's how you start developing games. You just jump into it. You just work on stuff. That's at least how I designed the game back then. I just added stuff. I just added features and more features and more features. Then I played some other games like Breath of Fire, and I thought, oh, this master system is great. Wow, you talk to a master and you learn stuff. Let's just add it to my own game, just like this. And then I had this idea. Oh man, you can actually level up stuff in games like Secret of Mana or some other games, and that's cool. I think it may have inspired by Grandia even. Oh, wow. And then I decided, oh yeah, let me just add these element levels, and another feature added. Then I just added features and features. Suddenly there was like a whole pile of features which was kind of not that well connected. And then I realized, it's probably not a good approach. So kind of like you should consider like a big picture. You should make like a plan. What are the main features, and kind of like have an idea that you have like enough complexity but not too much, kind of like trying to avoid redundancy. And
Right.
Tara's Adventure had a lot of redundancy, a lot of skills that you can use in combat where you're thinking, what's the difference between those skills? So why would I have this skill and this skill? So why do I have these both options if they do essentially the same thing?
Mm-hmm.
Or like, and that's kind of like, I realized that limiting the amount of options to kind of like make the choice feel more variable. That's something I learned with Tara's Adventure, and I kind of like applied this in the second game, which was Felsabor. Or Velsabor, actually, people don't know how to pronounce it. I also don't know how to pronounce this. There was a second game I still did in RPG Maker,
Mm-hmm.
and I really kind of like it was much better planned through, I think. And again, for CrossCode, we did the same thing. We actually planned the whole skill tree very early on, which actually we might have overdone it a bit because in the end the game has a lot of skills, but it kind of worked out. But we may have like a few like the number of combat arts might be a bit too high in the end, I think. But I guess it works out. Yeah.
As long as they're flashy, I mean, you've got no complaints from me on this part.
Yeah.
So, okay. For my next question, based on your knowledge of the team itself, like what sort of games outside of the ones that you mentioned, like Secret of Mana, Terra Enigma, stuff like that. What other games in general that you would say that the team has that inspired them to actually make games, for example, or even come into CrossCode?
Oh, what games inspired? I mean, there's a lot of games that inspired us for CrossCode. I can talk about those. I don't know what games in particular inspired everybody in the team. I know what kind of games some of my team members actually like to play.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Geflügel and me, we share a lot of games that we like to play. For instance, Valkyrie Profile.
Oh,
And
nice.
I think if you know Valkyrie Profile, always mispronounce this.
Yeah.
It's like I loved this game back then when I had it. I was just playing it. I just skipped the night when I actually started playing this back then. And I mean it's kind of like just the style and how it was animated and this kind of like some of the new combat arts that we just recently implemented, in fact, are very much inspired by Valkyrie Profile. Of some of these special attacks that you have in this game, for instance, and that's kind of like an inspiration. I think most of our team members actually like Xenoblade a lot,
Yes.
and I think Xenoblade had a very, very big influence on CrossCode, mostly because that was the game I played when I started working on CrossCode. So that was kind of like this kind of idea of having a JRPG which is still rather a little bit open world, so you can go around and you can do quests. I mean, that's exactly what you have in CrossCode too. It's just that the combat system is different. But I mean, the structure of CrossCode is very similar to Xenoblade in that sense.
Oh, that's really
And I
cool.
mean, a lot of our team members really like this games, and that's also why I'm currently playing another game, because I'm currently Xenoblade 2. So I'm not playing this much these days, but that's one of the games I actually allowed myself to play, mostly because I'm such a big fan of the series.
Right.
There's a lot of other games that we inspired to. For instance, Stefan or RD, he's a very big fan of Kingdom Hearts and also games like Devil May Cry.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of like this inspiration, I think, went into the combat system to some extent, that we wanted to have a very fast-paced combat system where it's not about menus, but more about just hitting buttons and
Right.
about reaction, about dodging things. And the list goes on. I mean, Terra Enigma was kind of like also a game a lot of us played, and there's some references in there. I mean, the graphic style kind of reminds you of Terra Enigma and also Chrono Trigger and
Right.
Secret of Mana. So in the end, there's not just one game that's in there. There's a lot of games mixed together, kind of like all the aspects that we like from the games that we used to play.
Oh, that's really cool. I'm happy that you mentioned Kingdom Hearts as well, because that's actually one of my favorite action RPGs. And a lot of people from my
Yeah.
side of the community definitely would agree that they definitely enjoy those games. So it's really cool
It's a
to see.
great game, definitely.
Yeah.
Especially, I really like the gameplay and the way they kind of animated the attacks, and
Yes. Yeah.
it had a
It's really
very nice
flashy.
way to work with camera and stuff like this. So
Yeah.
I'm always impressed when I see this even today. So
So real quick, out of how many of the Kingdom Hearts games have you played? Have you played all of them?
Actually, no. I just played the first two major games. I have to
Okay.
admit, I didn't play any of the mobile games. I mean the handheld games, and so I'm not really very much up to date. I just played Kingdom Hearts 1 and 2, but I think for the third game I actually might get back into it. Not entirely sure. Again, I'm not playing that many games these days,
Yes,
but
totally
I'm sure
understandable.
like Stefan played probably all of them, so he's very much up to date. So
He-
Radical Regiden, he's actually in the chat too, so
oh, okay,
I'm
that
sure
makes
he
sense.
played all of them.
Oh
So
yeah, I see him there. Yeah, I got the chat open so I can see people that are chatting in as well. And
mm.
just real quick, they might hang me for saying this, but you're not missing too much from the mobile games. They're not great, but that's just my opinion on it. Don't if you're gonna
You mean
don't
like in particular the mobile games
the
or like all
mobile
the
and a
handheld?
lot of the portable games. They were not
Okay.
the biggest. I was not a big fan of any of those games, and I played all of
I
them.
mean, I
So
once saw something. I saw one of the, I think, PSP games, which was there was like a HD version for PS3 or PS4.
yeah,
I think I saw that a bit, and I actually noticed that even though it's like a modern console, it didn't look quite as impressive as Kingdom
yeah,
Hearts 2 did.
yeah.
And you kind of noticed there's not quite the same production value back there. But I guess Kingdom Hearts 3 will be a different story. So,
Fingers
like,
crossed. I've got a lot of high hopes for that one
yeah.
too. Yeah. All right. So for my next question here, as we talked about a lot of games that shaped the CrossCode itself, for you as a developer, were there any games that actually shaped your perspective on game development?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
Like it,
Shape my perspective
yeah,
on game
like
development.
basically how you want to approach developing games, essentially.
I don't think there were any games that kind of. I mean, to some extent, maybe kind of like. Are you talking about things like how to handle scope and things like
Yeah,
this?
yeah.
I mean, one example that I always like to bring up is that something I kind of realized while working on my first two RPG Maker games is
Mm,
that I mean, scope is very important, and it's very important to limit that scope, especially if you're like a small developer,
right,
which you are when you're an indie developer.
right.
Um, and something I kind of realized is that when you have games like Final Fantasy, kind of like if you kind of try to reach for what those games did, you always have this conflict which impacts a whole world. So you have a lot of different countries which go to war, and there's like this really big epic conflicts, and it's those conflicts that are actually a lot of work to really proper create and visualize. And so I mean, just imagine just creating a city is a lot of work, so now you have to
Yeah.
create like 4 or 5 of them. And that's one thing, but another thing is also that then you want to have like some kind of war setting where there's a lot of going on, and when you have a war you have a lot of individual characters walking around doing stuff, and that's a lot of work to actually kind of like show this in the game, how to animate this, how to
Mhm.
kind of like script the movement of so many individual entities.
Right.
And that's actually something where I realized, wait, why do we actually have to do this? I mean, do you have do you need this epic scale to really make an interesting game? And then I thought there's a game like Aluntra, if you ever played that one.
Yes, I have.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Aluntra, I think, is really interesting in that sense because it is like a Zelda game, but it kind of evolves. I mean, it's kind of like a Zelda, but in my opinion, it has a more interesting story because Zelda was, to my opinion, not that much about story
Right.
in the first place. It's more about the gameplay. But
Definitely.
Aluntra had a pretty original take on this on the story, combined with the Zelda kind of gameplay. So you had like a village, and you also had like these kind of places around the village that you had to visit, kind of like these dungeons. But the nice twist was that things happened in the village. You had like characters that you knew by face and name. They had a character, and they had dreams. And in these dreams, you kind of like had to enter their dreams because they were kind of like imprisoned. They were essentially in bed, just streaming, and you had to free them by entering their dreams
Right.
and doing stuff. So, and then suddenly things became very personal because you're moving into the heads of individual characters of that village, and they kind of like what happened in those dreams is kind of very much specific to this character. And then people are actually dying in this village or surviving,
Right.
depending on how things go. And you realize, man, this is actually so much more interesting. It's really dramatic. You kind of like see what happens in this village, what happens to those people. And they combine this with like this normal going to dungeons things that you have in Zelda, but like the overall mix I thought was much more appealing.
Yeah.
Um, and that's like kind of like, and you don't have any global conflict in this game. It's all just about this village and what happens around it. There's no war, there's no massive conflict where a lot of people are fighting each other. It's just you kind of like dealing with problems of individual people. I mean, then you go into some dungeons and you bash a lot of enemies, but that's not really this kind of conflict between country thing. And it's kind of strange that I mean, I don't want to spoil the ending, so I'm probably not talk about this. But anyway, I thought kind of like there's one thing I realized then was that it's not so much about having these global conflicts. At least it doesn't have to be that way. It's more like about having these personal relationships with some people and these kind of personal conflicts, which kind of make a story very interesting. And I think some of these ideas actually moved into CrossCode as well. So
okay. That makes sense.
But I don't want to talk too much about this because it's my small things too. So.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Like we're trying to avoid spoilers in general when it comes to the game, so there will be no spoiler related questions when it comes to CrossCode.
Yeah, I'm probably pronouncing Zelda like Zelda or Zelda. It's Zelda. It's like a very confusing thing that I always get wrong is like Z and S are pronounced like the opposite in German.
Oh, right.
Like the Z is very sharp, so we say Zelda in German. And in English you would say Zelda, I guess. Right?
I never thought about that. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's like our languages are very, very similar in many ways, but there's some ways where they're different. Then you always notice. Like, yeah. Also the missing TH, of course.
And that's a different topic of discussion entirely.
Yeah.
So I want to move a little bit into the history of CrossCode. Feel free to correct me on this, but it's to my understanding that CrossCode was essentially a crowdfunded project.
That's correct, yes.
And that was on Indiegogo, right?
Exactly, yeah. That's how we kicked off development back in 2015.
Okay. So, like, tell me about how this whole thing started. Like, how did the idea of CrossCode start and the idea to move it to a crowdfunded project, I guess?
The whole idea started back in end of 2011, and we spent, since we did the crowdfunding in the beginning of 2015, you can make the math. It's like a little bit more than 3 years that we spent creating essentially the first demo version. I think we spent 1 year, like a bit more than a year or about a year, and then we released the first demo version already, which was even without close combat. It was just about ball throwing and like the basic puzzles and a bit of combat, but no RPG elements. So you had no menu and nothing else.
Right.
And then we spent another 2 years kind of like creating the first demo version, which already included the full plot of the cargo ship and kind of like a preview on the Autumn's Rise area. So you had like an outdoor area and also some puzzle elements, which would kind of change into the Rhombus dungeon that you had in the beginning.
Oh, right.
So we had all these elements kind of prepared for the first demo version. And then we did the crowdfunding. And I mean, the choice for crowdfunding was essentially we spent 3 years creating the foundation. And of course, we did like studying and work and other stuff in parallel. And if we would have continued like this, I'm not sure if we ever would have been able to finish a game of decent size. So that's why we want to work full time on this. And back then, crowdfunding was still a big thing. I'm not sure how it looks like today. I think it's getting harder and harder to actually crowdfund games because people are kind of getting more careful, which I think is a good thing. But I mean, anyway, even back then, it was not that easy in 2015 to actually crowdfund a game. But we still did it. We used Indiegogo because Kickstarter wasn't available in Germany.
Right.
Back then, it actually became available a few months later. So that was kind of annoying. But yeah, so that's why we had to use Indiegogo, which it's not the best platform, honestly. So I wouldn't recommend it in many reasons. And one of them is that people expect that it's always flexible funding. So they expect that if if they give you their money, they will not get it back even if you don't reach your goal, which is actually not true. That is one option. You can also do fixed funding, which is kind of like Kickstarter. It's not exactly the same, but it's very similar. But actually, people don't notice that. So, and that's why they think, oh, it's Indiegogo now. They're just gonna take the money even if they don't succeed.
Yeah.
And that's, that was really bad from a marketing's perspective. So that's why I would be very careful with Indiegogo. But we kind of did it. It took us 2 months to reach this. I mean, one advantage of Indiegogo, you can actually make very long campaigns. You can extend the period to 2 months, and we kind of did it. It was very close, but we did it, and then yeah.
Yeah, so
Then
you can't extend campaigns like that on let's say Kickstarter, for example, can you?
I don't think so. I'm not perfectly sure, but I think that's just an Indiegogo thing.
Huh. Yeah,
And I think they did the same for Indivisible, in fact, if I remember correctly.
I think they did too, actually, because that was another game that I looked at that was part of my consideration list as well. It's funny because like when you look back at some of the history of Kickstarter or crowdfunding campaigns, like at least a few years ago, it was kind of this new thing that people were getting into, and everybody was like, yeah, this is gonna work. And then as time went on and people got burned by a couple of campaigns that happened in the past, everyone's become more careful about it, and there's selections and things like that. So I can imagine it was really hard to get into that and actually find a good platform to stand on, and to get the social outreach for people to come and help fund the game. That's totally understandable.
Yeah, I mean, like the platform that you choose is just one small aspect. I mean, it's not you have to do a lot of marketing when you do crowdfunding, and those 2 months were essentially a full-time job for us, just going around trying to reach out to wherever we could to kind of like make people aware of this campaign. It's very difficult to reach the press back then. I mean, in the beginning it probably was easier, but around that time it was difficult to actually get any major article. We were lucky enough that Rock Paper Shotgun reported on us, so that was rather helpful.
Yeah.
We didn't have any luck with Kotaku though, or other pages like this. So yeah, and that like contacting streamers also, like we had a few larger streamers from Germany that actually played our game, and that's mostly due to personal contact. So we know a few people which kind of like were connected to the German RPG Maker community again. And through those connections, I think we had like some rather large German streamers playing the game during the campaign, which definitely helped a lot. But yeah, it's very hard. And I think one thing that I think is definitely good to have is a good demo version. That's something that we created. And again, we spent 3 years creating this demo version, so people can actually play the game and can be kind of confident that it might actually be fun to have this game. But I'm actually not sure if it's actually automatically makes your campaign successful, because I think I have the impression that the first impression that you get from just watching screenshots and the video is probably much more important, and it's very difficult to get that right, I think. So because there's so many campaigns which were really successful and that didn't have anything to play, that just had a very fancy video. And so obviously it must be that just having like the right nice first impression, like good graphics, a good video, that's really what drags people into something. I mean, Hyperlight Drifter was a huge success back then in Kickstarter. I think almost 1 million they made, or like 500,000,
It was somewhere around that ballpark. Like for me, it comes down to a case of when these crowdfunding campaigns start, I tend to learn about the game after the campaigns have ended, of course. So I can't always back them the way that I want to at the time. For the case of CrossCode, like I found out about CrossCode because I watched a popular streamer play it, and I'm like, holy crap, this game looks awesome. I should totally pick this up. And then I bought it on Steam after that. And in this case for Hyperlight Drifter, where I found out about that game as well after the campaign ended. So
really? Okay.
Yeah, so that was
actually
unfortunate.
I actually saw the campaign while it was running, because it was such a big impact, and since we were already thinking about doing crowdfunding, I think that's why we also had some kind of we looked into other projects that did that at the time. And I mean, Hyperlight Drifter just had this really, back then it was an incredibly unique graphic style, and it was really impressive. And I think it dragged in people like crazy. And I think that's, again, there was no demo back then at all, and it was just this amazing video and this amazing graphics that attract people in.
Yeah.
I mean, the final game also turned out really well, so I guess that's just great the way it went. But yeah, I mean, I guess the first impression is really what is important, and however you get the right first impression, that's you don't know. It kind of worked for CrossCode. I think it worked because we kind of went for this Super Nintendo style graphics style, and it's not that common for indie games yet, at least. So
it definitely does help to have that good first impression for sure, which is kind of what got me into the whole thing in the first place. So after the campaign is ended, you guys got the money that you were looking for, or at least got to a point where you were satisfied with. Can you tell me about how CrossCode, in terms of its scope and such, may have been changed or altered from its initial idea back when the campaign ended up to this point today?
I'm actually very proud about the fact that the initial scope barely changed at all. I'm very happy about this. I mean, we had this kind of idea. Like we had a number of locations planned, and when you look back at the Indiegogo campaign, we actually showed the locations. We had some artworks, and there was Basin Keep. Basin Keep was actually shown there. The jungle area was shown. The heat area was shown, and of course Bergen. I mean, nothing of that was created, but we kind of stick to the plan, and we created everything that was actually shown in the campaign. And I think there were like a few locations that I kind of roughly planned and that we dropped fairly early on. I mean, probably around the time when we did the crowdfunding, maybe shortly afterwards, and we never really announced those. So that's why I thought about it and think, yeah, that's not really necessary. And then we just dropped it. And in fact, there have been a few features where my approach was, let's try to do this. And if it turns out it's too difficult, we have to think of something else. But those features were party members and quests, I think. The idea was, let's try to do quests because it's an MMO, and that worked out. I think quests were something that we definitely wanted to do because we had this kind of MMO setting, and not having quests would feel rather strange. And we also wanted something like Xenoblade again. So that's why we wanted to have quests. But when it came to party members, really the approach was, I'm not 100% sure if it will work. So let's just try it. And if it doesn't work out, we will try something else. But we actually, since we had some pretty decent navigation system, implementing party members was actually feasible. And then it ended up as a feature. And I think there's like a few small features that I had an idea very early on. Some feature where you could, as kind of like a base move, grab enemies and throw them around. I don't even know why. I mean, it kind of like, it looks cool, but if I now think about it, it doesn't really fit in all that well, and we kind of dropped that pretty early on. Also, originally I had a much more complicated system in mind for combat arts, and I'm kind of happy that we simplified that. I mean, I think people like Geflügel talked me out of this to not do this, and that was probably a good idea. There was small details like this, but other than that, we didn't even cut that much, and that's one of the reasons why the game has been in development for quite some time already. We kind of we're very stubborn. We don't want to cut stuff. We just want to make it how we imagined it, and how we feel that the pacing will be good in the end.
And from what I can tell so far, it's definitely been paying off in terms of how great the game is played and how well polished it is at this point in development. So you talk a little bit about the idea of the game, obviously taking place in an MMO and a lot of Xenoblade inspirations for the quests and stuff like that. But my question is, what is your approach to like designing quests, and how do you keep them from becoming to a point where they're either overwhelming or monotonous, mundane, things like that, so that players are just entirely skipping them as they go through the main story of the game?
When it comes to quests, I mean, I'm actually not the guy who creates most of the quests. I just create like a very few main story relevant quests. Most of the quests are created by Geflügel and RD, again, like Radical Regidon. And I think, so first of all, I think there's like different opinions. Like, since we are fans of Xenoblade, we are actually like we don't have a huge problem with quests being somewhat redundant. Like if some of the quests are about killing enemies and collecting items, we don't have a huge problem with that. But we actually can do things somewhat better in by just. I mean, when I design dungeons, I mean that's one of my major tasks. When I design dungeons, I always have this kind of approach. Every room must be something new. Like
Right.
every room, something new must happen. It doesn't have to be some entirely new concept, just taking something and adding something that makes it new. Like when you fight a bunch of moth in one room, in the next room you fight a bunch of moth, but then there's like some endless ground, some hole in the room where it can fall down, and then you
Right.
have to make sure that the moth will not fall down there, because then they will fly up again. And though that's something new, and that I kind of try to do this with every room in the dungeon, and I think for quests it's kind of like the same idea that we kind of like always try to do something new. It doesn't mean you have to be something entirely different,
Mhm.
but I mean, to some extent, it's simple because we do have all these puzzle elements that we
Right.
introduce in dungeons, and we can reuse those puzzle elements for the quests, and that works rather well. And I mean, a lot of the very creative quests I think have been created, all especially by Geflügel. He's always um, playing around with the script engine that we have in the game, and we kind of like designed the game in a way that you can actually play around with all the functionality, combine it in strange ways. It's actually very similar to RPG Maker in that sense, because
Mhm.
RPG Maker had this kind of event-based scripting system, and we have the same thing in CrossCode, just that it's much more extendable, so we can kind of do weird stuff with it. And then Hannah goes ahead and implements something like a tower, like a defense quest where you have to defend a tree. And then he does stuff like, I don't know, where you have to shoot something to a certain point so that the shield disappears from enemies. And he's just experimenting with a lot of strange ideas.
Right.
Uh, like most of the time, I think it turns out really fun. Sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming, but overall, it definitely keeps the quests fresh. So that's mostly his contribution to the project. I would say that he always tries to implement some new mechanics. Um, so not all the quests are like this, but a lot of quests kind of like try to introduce something new,
Mhm.
something fresh, and yeah, I guess that's how we kind of like try to keep quests interesting.
That's pretty cool. Like, well, definitely have to get him on this an interview sometime in the future to talk about his approach to quests as well.
Mm.
So as we talk about this MMO like aspect of CrossCode, the skill tree. I want to talk a bit about that real quick, because when I first played the game, you know, you open up the skill tree when you get your first set of points, and you see that, and you realize like this is a pretty decent skill tree. I can see where custom ability would come in from this, and then you go to the first major dungeon, you get your first element, and then I had this moment where it took me back the same way, let's say, Path of Exile skill tree does, where I'm like, oh my god, what is
Yeah,
this? So
that was
how
kind
did
of
that
the
all come to part?
inspiration.
Yeah, let's talk about that a
I
bit.
mean,
about that a bit.
yeah, well, I mean, Path of Exile was pretty much the inspiration for that skill tree, I think. I mean, in combination with games like Final Fantasy X, maybe the Zero Bread, Zero Board, it's kind of similar. I mean, yeah, essentially just having like a huge skill tree, which where not every skill is like something that you can use in combat, but a lot of passive skills in there.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean that was mostly I was designed by me and Geflügel, I think. Uh, so, and that was one of the things that we actually planned more or less completely very early on. There were some placeholders for skills where we didn't know exactly what they were doing, and we kind of like were filling this over the development. But stuff like the number of skills and the number of combat arts that you will get for each element was fixed very early on.
Mhm.
And that's why I'm saying that maybe we kind of like fixed the planning a bit too much, so we kind of like restricted ourselves to this fixed structure
Right.
very early on, and that I'm not sure if that was the best idea, but I think it worked out rather well in the end. I mean, you might have a bit more skills than you actually need, but that's actually not such a bad thing. That means we can make interesting post-game content essentially, where you
Ah,
can actually
okay.
use most of these skills,
That actually sounds
I
really
think.
cool.
Yeah,
It
I
gives me something to look
mean,
forward to, at least when it comes to planning out that skill tree.
yeah.
So like as we go through the skill tree and stuff like that, you can see the abilities for combat arts and stuff like that. So how did that? Tell me about how the idea of combat arts came into play, like the animations, the style of them, how they work with different elements, and how that plays into the gameplay essentially.
Sorry again. Can you repeat the last part again? I
No
kind of
problem. Like the
blacked
combat
out
arts,
there.
like how did those the idea for combat arts come into play, and how did that balance that into gameplay? How do you guys balance that into gameplay? I guess I could say.
Combat arts. I mean, combat arts. We first had the basic mechanics of the game, which was throwing, and then we added melee.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, we added, I mean, dashing was there pretty early on. I think first we had just throwing balls and dashing. That were also the first two actions that you had.
Right.
Then we added close combat. And then we added guarding. And then we had these 4 base skills. And I think somewhere along the way, we just had the good idea to kind of connect combat arts to those 4 base actions. And I still think it's a very nice system that you kind of like, it's very intuitive. Essentially, you do the usual thing and then you just press space or like the special button on the gamepad, and then you just do a special move with that in combination with that basic move, like a guarding art or a throwing art or a close combat art. And I still like the system. I think it's a good idea. I mean, there are some downsides. Sometimes it's you might kind of like do another art when you were supposed to do one of the others. Like people like sometimes mix up the close combat and the dashing melee, the dashing combat arts. But I mean, that's kind of like the trade-off in the end. I mean, you could have different buttons, but I think the system would just play less intuitive, more like would be more difficult to actually to learn properly if you had several buttons. So I think if you actually get used to some of the details, it works really well. So that was kind of like the basic idea, kind of like combining combat arts with those basic moves. And other than that, we just collected ideas. I mean, there's not a single person who's responsible for this. Essentially, we always did some brainstorming among ourselves, kind of writing down ideas, sketching out ideas, and we even asked people in our game dev stream once, "Hey, do you have ideas for combat arts?" And they just wrote stuff in the chat, and we collected some. And actually, some of the combat arts happened because of that. I think one example. Let me think. What was one thing that actually happened? I think the lightning chain attack was something that somebody suggested in the stream, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe somebody else did this too. But there's some combat arts that essentially happened because people suggested that here and there, and kind of like just collecting ideas. But in general, we always try this approach. Again, every combat art must be somewhat unique. I mean, first of all, you don't have to make sure that every single one is unique because you have elements. So if you have like essentially the same attack for heat and cold, it's not a big deal because the element is different. So there's a reason why you have both of them. But if you have now 2 close combat attacks for heat, there should be something different about it. And usually what we do is we make it, one is focused on single targets with high damage, and another one is focused on multiple targets with less damage. So you have a more range essentially. Yeah, and so that's kind of like the approach, like always try to make them feel different. There's a different purpose for those combat arts, so that something we always try to avoid is that this is the best combat art and the other one is always useless. Even though that's really difficult, I mean, there might end up some combat arts which are in practice rather useless, but sometimes you're still surprised. I mean, there was this one combat art where you essentially are blocking for some time all damage, and the damage that you receive is recovered. So you're actually healing damage that you receive during this combat art. That's a really risky technique to some extent. So you're spending a lot of SP for, you're not even dealing damage, you're just taking attacks and then you're healing. But somebody actually used that in one of the boss fights. And that was really, really cool to watch. So I was really happy to see that people actually use those strange combat arts. So I'm pretty sure there will be combat arts that are more popular and some that are less popular, but we really hope that then at least we won't have any combat art that's entirely useless. But again, that's also something where early access helps a lot, so we can collect the feedback from players and can adapt some combat arts if we feel that some are really truly not that useful. And yeah.
Yeah, like I find like that regardless of how daunted I was by the skill tree at first when I first saw it, there's a lot of utility there where you can see different skill builds coming out of that, and I'll be looking forward to see the kinds of different builds that people make, in the final release when there's the game is in everyone's hands and they start making videos about that and seeing cool things that come out of it, which I think would be an interesting thing to have happen after the game comes out is in final release. So you mentioned a little bit about how the fans influenced a little bit of the combat art development during one of your streams. And I was kind of curious about has there been any other instances where fan or backer suggestions have influenced some ideas that have gone into CrossCode, either now or in the past?
There have been plenty of occasions. I mean, some, especially when it comes to quality of life content, people made a lot of suggestions, and sometimes we actually listen to that and also implement it. Not all the times, but like there's some very popular features that we didn't implement and we probably also won't implement. First of all, multiplayer. No, there will not be multiplayer. Like online multiplayer. Local multiplayer is something that we might implement, but online multiplayer just isn't realistic for us at all. With the knowledge that we have from writing net code, it's just it would essentially be suicide for the whole project to implement multiplayer on a multiplayer. But there's stuff like essentially we had those traders, and people had kind of like a hard time remembering all the traders that you find in the game. And that's why we added the trader book. So you kind of like get a list of all traders that you meet in the game. So that was essentially implemented because of feedback. And then we have destructible plans, and people wanted to kind of like have a collection of items, kind of like an overview. What items do you actually get from which plan? So in case I want to get a certain item, they can check which item they need to destroy. And that's why eventually we also implemented a botanics menu.
Oh yeah.
Sometimes there's sometimes a little bit of disagreement when it comes to this, especially when it comes to hand holding. There's like some people in our team have the opinion like we should add not too much of it, because people should kind of like work a little bit, do a little bit of research, and try to remember a little bit of stuff. So it actually feels like it's like an achievement to do certain things. And some other people think that it's kind of like something you should provide the information, because otherwise people will just go to Wikipedia or on a web page and check it anyway.
Right.
So what's the point of not just adding it into the game? So, but so far we kind of like always found some kind of compromise that seems to work. In case of the botanics menu, we decided to kind of like you get this information, but you have to do some work first. You first have to go around, destroy some of the plants, and eventually you will actually unlock the information about what items they drop. And I think it's a very nice compromise. It's also nice because you have another kind of like collectible aspect, so you actually can track how many plants you destroyed. Then it's another thing you can do in the game, essentially just completing your botanics list.
That's actually really cool. Yeah, because you hear a lot of situations where developers allow their fans to provide feedback and make suggestions into the game, but literally several occasions where I've seen your streams where you're working on the combat arts and fans were suggesting the ideas that you were asking for, and suddenly they end up in the game, and other suggestions as well. And that's not something you see all that often when it comes to development and games, whether they be AAA or indie. And I think that's really cool to see for you guys as well, and in general, honestly. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
Oh no, go ahead.
Oh, just want to say in general, I think that early access is actually a very good experience for us. So like, it's not just that it actually helps us to develop the game for a longer time, but it's just because like this interaction with the community really helps us to polish up the games in a way that we couldn't do by ourselves. So I really believe that early access is a great thing. It's kind of sad to see that it has such a horrible reputation, even though it's understandable, since some developers just misuse it and essentially just get the money, but they don't do the proper work that is kind of required if you want to do a proper early access project. But in principle, you can really use early access in very meaningful ways, I think. So
it's actually really cool. And to touch on that a little bit, Like, what was the decision making that went behind putting this game in early access instead of doing what a lot of other developers have done, which is finish the campaign of crowdfunding and then go completely non-disclosure until the game is essentially ready with subtle updates on the webpage.
I think we had this. I don't know exactly why, but it's kind of strange. I mean, we looked at a lot of other crowdfunding campaigns, and most of them kind of like gave you the beta perk, so you get the game early.
Right.
And some other gave you then you have another perk which is cheaper, where you just get the game once it's finished, which is kind of strange. So in crowdfunding, you often have it like a different order. Like you pay more to get the beta version, and you pay less to get the final product. When you don't talk about early access pricing, it's usually like the opposite way.
Right.
Like you get it cheap first, and later it's more expensive. And
Right.
that was really strange to us, because we, with this mindset of crowdfunding, we started early access. In the beginning, we thought, yeah, the game will be cheaper once it's released. Is that that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
No,
How
there
does
was
that work?
like no. Well, in the end, we decided to just keep the price, so we won't make it cheaper, so it will stay. The price will stay. But yeah, I think there was no. We kind of like we just thought, hey, if you already have like this beta perk where people can play the game early, so why should we not offer early access? I mean,
Right.
essentially, we are offering something to the people so they can test it early, and we get feedback. So, and if people want to buy the game early, sure, why not? I mean, it's another option. That was kind of like the idea. It just felt like the natural choice, and I think it's kind of interesting that a lot of crowdfunded games that did provide this beta option actually didn't move to early access. Now that I think about it. Which is kind of interesting, because I mean, to us it just felt natural, but I think some people may not like to do this. I mean, to some extent, we got a little bit of backlash, like people saying first you got crowdfunded, but now you also do early access. But it actually wasn't that bad. I mean, in the end, we actually never stated in the crowdfunding that some will finance the whole development of the game. When we went sometime during the campaign, we went a bit more explicit with that, and we actually stated that we hope that the money will help to kick off development,
Right.
kind of like. And then we were planning to get funding through other ways. One of them was early access, and another one was essentially trying to apply for some state programs, which in the end didn't work out. But fortunately, early access was successful enough for us to actually make kind of like finance long-term development. Now the weird thing is that, I mean, not what weird. I mean, when we announced this explicitly, some people have been kind of taken aback by that, and they kind of like retracted their contribution, wanted to get the money back, and so you have to be careful with that.
Yeah.
Some people really expect that when you do crowdfunding, you kind of plan to develop the game with this sum, but that's actually very difficult in practice.
Yeah.
So I mean, in the end, it's just how it kind of evolved. We just thought it makes sense to kind of do the combination of crowdfunding early access, and I think in the end, it worked out really well for us. So, no particular reason for that otherwise.
Yeah. I think the extra time and that extra funding definitely paid off in the end, and it's got a much more, I guess you could say, broader project coming out of it at the end of the day. And I think that
Yeah.
that definitely pays off in a lot more ways than people think when it comes to things like that. So that's it's great to hear about that success. So I guess as we get closer to the end of this interview.
Oh, this is already 1 hour. Okay. Well, okay.
We're close to the end. So I guess to wrap things up, I should say, are there any, concluding thoughts or anything that you would like to say to the people that are watching this, either who are already playing the game, part of the Discord community or the CrossCode community, or for those that are learning about this for the first time? Are there any final words that you'd like to say before we wrap this up?
Let me think. Just again saying thanks to everybody who is actually following development and giving us feedback and cheering on us to actually finish the game eventually. So especially being patient enough to wait for the final release, because we have postponed the release a couple of times already. And it's not like we just like to do this. I kind of like, in the end, we just kind of like have to balance expectations and reality kind of like this. And it's kind of strange sometimes if you say, yeah, we just now, we started early access and now we will release, like, let's say 2018 middle or end of 2018. We would say that right in the beginning. A lot of people would say, why, this takes forever, we will never support this. And then in the end, I mean, it would be like the most honest thing to do. But the thing is, even we ourselves didn't think it would take that long. I mean, honestly, you're always kind of like, whenever it comes to things like this, you're more optimistic than you should be. And even if you try to be pessimistic, you still end up being too optimistic in the end. It's really weird. So I'm just happy that people are patient, and that they're most of our player base, actually, whenever we kind of like announce that we have to postpone the release, they are mostly understanding and saying that the important thing is that the game will end up being a good game. So that's what's important to most of our players, and I'm very thankful to that. So I think that's one important thing I wanted to say. Yeah.
No problem at all. Well, Felix, I'd like to thank you for joining me today on the show. Much appreciated. And at any point in the future, I would love to have you back on again, maybe sometime after the game has come out and everything is said and done, and you've had your nice long vacation that's well deserved. At some point in the future, I would love to have you, and if anybody else from the team would like to join in, be more than happy to have you guys in on the interview again at some point in the future. Does that sound like a good idea?
Right, yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a very nice interview. So if you want to talk again sometime after the release, no problem.
All right, awesome.
I'll be ready to do that. So,
and of course, one final question before we go about that quicksand.
Yep. I shouldn't have wrote that. You just have to fall down. God damn it. No, that's a weird insider.
Yeah.
Like, we had to, we kind of like the quicksand puzzle used to be different. And we made like 3 revisions or something until people stopped asking. And I was kind of getting frustrated. Now people make kind of like a joke, keep asking about the quicksand puzzles. But yeah, I guess it works now the way it is. So
awesome. That's awesome. Well, again, thank you so much again. And thank you to all the people at home that watch this. I will definitely have this interview archived and uploaded on YouTube if you happen to miss the beginning or anything like that. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, that's gonna do it for this episode, guys. I'll have more interviews planned in the future, so keep stay locked to Twitter, YouTube, and stuff like that to get updates on that as well. But until next time, you guys take care, stay sharp, assassins, and I'll see you next time.
Bye bye.